line of five topical synchronization force workshops. So as you might know, you have arrived to the Persistent Identifier workshop. And with me today, I have my colleague Elisa Maria Mankinen from CSC, acting as a rapporteur. My name is Josephine Nordling, also working at CSC, and I will be chairing this workshop today. Could you go to the next slide? Thank you. So the main ambition of this workshop is to discuss trust and sustainability around PIDs and PID systems. And this discussion will feed into the work on defining assessment criteria for PID policies. So first off, I want to say that this workshop is all about generating discussions around this topic. So I really encourage you to ask and comment and discuss very freely, but also to add content both to the spreadsheet and as well as to the collaborative note-taking document. Now, next slide, please. So this is the program for today. So in order to understand the ongoing work related to the PID policy assessment, we have invited Wim Hugo from DUNS to tell us about the Compliance Assessment Toolkit, also known as CAT, developed within our sister project called FAIRcore for IOSC. So the CAT is a service based on a set of concepts implemented as a graph database and is accessible via APIs. And so the toolkit will support the IOSC PID policy with services to encode, record, and query compliance with the policy. Next, you will hear from Natasha van Lieshout from SERV, some of the results of a workshop that took place last week on Tuesday called IOSC Compliant PID Implementations, Practical Guidelines for Implementing Best Practices. And there, the CAT toolkit was tested in different research workflows. After this, I will briefly present the PID use case work going on in the Fair Impact project. And in order to set the scene for discussing trust in PID systems, I will also provide a quite quick overview of the results from a quite recently published knowledge exchange study on PIDs and related risks and trust components. And lastly, we will hear some reflections on trust in PIDs from 4 out of our 8 in total use case partners involved in the Fair Impact project. And here also, I want to encourage everyone to join in on the discussions whenever you feel like it, whenever it feels like you have something to say and add to the discussion. And after this, we can delve more deeper into the discussions around what you all have been prepared for up front. Next slide, please. And I want to make sure you're aware that this session will be recorded, but only for internal purposes and will not be published anywhere. So it's just to assist us in taking notes after this session and making sure that we captured everything correctly. And so probably in the chat, you have already received the links to the spreadsheet and to the note-taking document. So please make sure to populate those as well. I think you've probably already participated in 1 or 2 previous workshops. Just to reiterate that the spreadsheet and the note-taking documents will both be open for you to add into until the 10th of December. And just as a reminder, here are the 3 questions, if you can go to the slide, that we have asked you all up front. So what does your project or initiative do to implement PIDs? And here it's really would be good if we could get also some links or references to some of the work done here. And what are the guiding principles for you when choosing a PID system or a service? And lastly, what does, in your opinion, constitute trust in a PID service? So these are the questions, but without further ado, we have Wim Hugo from Dance presenting on the Compliance Assessment Toolkit. So please, Wim, go ahead.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes, thanks. You can go, maybe skip 2 slides. The first section deals with the context and the process. So we started out in the FAIR Core for EOS project with the European Commission's PID policy really EOSC's PID policy as published by the European Commission. So that's the first and leftmost circle on the slide that you're looking at. And we are representing the content of that persistence identifier policy with a certain font, because it is largely written as a prose document, which is quite common, but of course is not so easy for machines to act on. So in the FAIR Core for EOS project, we published the requirements and specifications for a for a compliance assessment toolkit that could be used, amongst other things, to evaluate compliance with the PID policy. And as a large part of that work, we took the EOS PID policy and converted it into more, let's say, machine actionable content that defined exactly what could be measured for each of the criteria in the policy, what kind of metrics would apply, what kind of tests would be executed to verify compliance with each of the criteria, and then also provided ways to link each of those tests and criteria to guidance and best practices that we envisaged would be available in a type of a knowledge base. So that's now been published, and you can have a look at it. It's a fairly lengthy document, but the bits that are important are in the annexures at the back, where the EOS PID policy is one of the inputs that we analyze to determine the specifications. And as you can see, in the process, we identified potentially 1 or 2 additional criteria that was not present in the original PID policy. And of course, the additional considerations or proposals on how to reformulate the policy provisions so that they indicate exactly who's responsible and whether it's mandatory or not. Those kinds of considerations we have shared with a task force for PID policy, and they will hopefully be able to provide us with some feedback on that in the near future. So that's the work that FAIR Core for EOSC has done to date. And in the process, of course, we have also now finalized work on the beta release of the Compliance Assessment Toolkit. So that will become available through engagement with selected communities over the course of the next month or 2. And then as soon as we are able to, we will make it available to a wider audience. But in FAIR Impact, we've also started working on related topics. So that is quite a far-ranging or wide-ranging effort in Work Package 3, where we're looking at community expectations in relation to persistent identifiers, the typical use cases and workflows where persistent identifiers might be required, whether there are any existing PID policies, and what best practices are that come from these policies or other types of documentation that we can find that relates to the use of persistent identifiers. And it is inevitable that in that process, we are identifying a number of additional considerations or expectations from the community on what persistent identifier services and offerings should provide. And we are busy systematically analyzing these and getting it into shape so that that can also feed into a potential future revision of the EOS PID policy. Now, the work that we're doing there, I think, is quite important because it balances the demand for persistent identifiers by analyzing what the end users want and how they want to apply persistent identifiers with the characteristics and features and attributes of the existing PID landscape. And of course, there may be mismatches between the two. That's one thing that we can determine from it. And then secondly, there's also the possibility then to match persistent identifier stacks, as we call them, with specific end user requirements that can be expressed in the same terms. So that work is ongoing in Fair Impact. And then if everything works out properly, the rightmost circles on the diagram, that will take us to a point sometime in next year, hopefully, where we have a well-structured knowledge base on the characteristics and features and attributes of persistent identifier systems, together with best practices in regard of applying them, matched with the use cases and workflows of the community, and then potentially, if needed, suggestions on how to extend the EOS PID policy to cover a wider array of use cases. So that work we hope to conclude towards the end of next year. We're also looking in the background at testing services. Most of the compliance assessment toolkit at this point is a self-assessment process where the actors in the landscape or in the ecosystem have to answer a series of questions and provide requisite evidence in some cases. But for two very important aspects of persistent identifiers, it is possible probably possible to develop explicit services to verify them with. And this pertains to resolution, whether persistent identifiers actually resolve to something useful, which, by the way, is not so easy to determine, but we are working on that. And then also persistence, because it's an obvious characteristic of persistent identifiers that the expectation is there that they should be persistent. That expectation is sometimes that it should be persistent into eternity, which is clearly not realistic. But there's a wide variety of performance in existing persistent identifier services in respect of persistence, and we are looking at ways to measure that a little bit more explicitly. On the next slide, there's an example of the standardization and structuring that we did in respect of the EOS PID policy. So typically we would assign these criteria to principles or objectives, and sometimes a criterion is useful to contribute or evaluate alignment with more than one principle or objective. There's typically a description of such a criterion, a metric associated with it, and then a benchmark. So once one has measured some kind of level of, or some kind of a result in terms of the different tests that are applicable, you must still determine whether this is a good result or a bad result. And that's where the benchmarks come in, is to try and assign some aspect of acceptability of performance in terms of what the community expects to the outcomes of the results. So I'm not going to dive very deeply into this, but there are 35 of these different criteria, each with one or more tests and metrics and benchmarks as proposals. And we're using this as the basis of implementing the compliance assessment toolkit initially. You can skip to the next slide, which quickly, and the next that quickly explains this idea of persistent identifier stacks. As I've mentioned, we are busy analyzing the landscape to determine the scope and typical functionalities and features of all these PID offerings that we encounter. But in many cases, these PID stacks require competent performance from more than one actor. In the most complicated cases, there's 3 or 4 of these different actors that all have to do a proper job to ensure the the usefulness of a PID system. And in other cases, that's maybe just one entity that you have to interact with as a user, an owner, and or a manager of persistent identifiers. So this is just for information so that you know to what extent and depth we are analyzing the landscape. And on the next slide, there are some examples of persistent identifier stacks. These are largely based on the handle system and the DOI stack, but there are, of course, many others. So we're building up a knowledge base of all the different persistent identifier stacks and what actors are involved in provisioning the service ultimately to owners and end users. You can skip 2 slides then. Yeah, that one is fine. So in the Compliance Assessment Toolkit, we are trying to achieve some objectives to make it useful for the community. So for the authorities and providers in the ecosystem, we want to provide an opportunity to back up public claims of policy compliance and of performance and features with information that's publicly available. Those assessments will initially all be self-assessments, and within the FAIR Call for EOSC and FAIR Impact projects, we will be engaging with these authorities to assist them and to get their consent on creating these assessments so that it's available publicly. For managers, those are the likes of people that mint persistent identifiers, typically on behalf of the owners of research outputs and other resources. I think it's optional to disclose policy compliance for purposes of engendering trust in the user community and acceptance. And those assessments will initially all be self-assessments, and there is obviously then no obligation to publish them. You can use them essentially just to determine your own performance and areas where improvements can be made. But as we said, it may be useful to publish them for reasons of trust and acceptance in the community. And then for owners and users, the knowledge-based type work that we are doing will be helpful to determine applicable services for use cases and to determine whether and to what extent they are policy compliant or not. So on the next slide, this is very early days in terms of our compliance assessment toolkit as a product, but everything is working already, although it hasn't yet been let's say, improved in terms of user experience through feedback and expert input. But in broad terms, one can look at existing assessments across the different actors in the landscape, or potentially add assessments in different roles or as different actors in the landscape. On the next slide, we indicate sort of how such an assessment would be created. So first of all, someone has to register, of course, in the system. And if they are going to provide self-assessments, we have to verify that they represent the actor that they claim to represent. So for argument's sake, if I want to register self-assessment of dance as a manager, then administrators in the system have to verify that I can indeed act on behalf of dance to provide that self-assessment. And once that's been done, on the next slide, one can then go and indicate all of the services and or objects that you are providing a self-assessment for. You can determine the visibility of these assessments and what the rights and licensing are that applies to it, and describe the services and or objects that you are assessing in a little bit more detail. The next slide, you can see that for each of these assessments, one can work your way through all of the different applicable criteria, and then answer questions or execute tests that contribute to the metric for that particular criterion. And then sort of middle right towards the top, you can see the way in which the compliance assessment toolkit keeps score of compliance or not with all the different criteria. Now, there are two classes of criteria. Some of them are mandatory and some of them are optional. At the moment, we have configured the assessment to say that if you fail one of the, or if you don't comply with one of the mandatory requirements, you're obviously not compliant. But for the optional ones, we are using the level of compliance as a type of a ranking. But with community engagement during the course of the next several months, we might alter the way in which we formulate the final assessment, because this is just a starting point for how we want to provide some form of assessment result from a compilation of all the different criteria. On the next slide, it's a little bit more information in terms of how one manages your own assessment. You can obviously assess the same object or service over time and elect to publish only some of the results. So for each service or object that an account is providing self-assessments for, there might be many of these assessments. And then in practice, in our next release, we will be consolidating all of these assessments that are publicly available into a typical search and discovery interface and into dashboards that summaries the state of compliance across the landscape for end users. So I think I'll end there and happy to answer questions. The other two slides are just in case there are some questions, but I don't think we will be needing them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wim. I think we will move forward with Natasha's presentation, who I already mentioned will be presenting some of the results from a workshop that took place last week, where the cat was tested in different research workflows. So please go ahead, Natasha.
Yeah, thank you so much, Josephine, and thanks for the presentation, Wim. So we'll go straight into the next slide. So as Josephine mentioned, last week on Tuesday, we had a mouthful of a workshop called the EOS Compliant PID Implementations Practical Guidelines for Implementing Best Practices workshop. This was a part of task 3.4, or the PID implementation program task in Fair Impact. The goal was to demonstrate concrete tools, policies, and developments within the realm of PIDs from the EOS projects and use that to fuel further innovation through the Fair Impact Open Support Call in January 2024. As mentioned, we did present not only kind of an introduction into the EOS PID policy and other policy documents about PIDs within EOS, but also a first peek at the compliance assessment toolkit that you just saw, and this kind of structuring of PIDs within research workflows. And then we had a bunch of breakout sessions and discussions to really get people thinking about where can we still improve things for PIDs was really the goal, but then structured within this idea that we have certain types of research outputs and objects or inputs, and that we need PIDs along those whole workflows. So if you could go to the next slide. We also, why would we do that? Why would we care? If we take a step back, this project was started in part because of the results from a European research data landscape study back in 2021 and 2022. During that study, they asked some 15,000 people whether they had used the FAIR principles before, which startlingly for me anyway, almost 40% of respondents said they had never heard of the FAIR principles before. They also asked them about using persistent identifiers with their data, and there as well, 41% of the respondents said that they had never used it. So it's very clear that even up until last year, I guess, 2022, there is not the type of PID implementation within the research landscape that we would be hoping for. And so I think that there is still a lot of room to grow. And that was also clear through the workshop. So if you go to the next slide, please. Yeah, we basically first started off our workshop by asking very similar questions of our respondents from that survey. I'm happy to report, though, that in this case, we had an audience that was at least familiar with the FAIR principles. They were also all familiar with PIDs, which is probably a good sign if they're coming to a PID workshop. But I think that one thing that was a little bit striking from our respondents was the lack of familiarity with the EOS PID policy itself, where you can see that only one respondent to our little Mentimeter, which was not our whole audience, but still only one had read and actually implemented aspects of the EOS PID policy, which again also forms the basis of this CAT and underpins quite a lot of the work in this project. If you go to the next slide, please. We also asked them basically about what they came to this workshop for, because I think it's also, our audience was very broad. We invited basically anyone who was interested. And I think it's interesting to see that, again, people are very interested in learning more about this EOS PID policy and best practices for using PIDs, as well as just how to use a PID in general, these very fundamental questions about PIDs. We had a couple of respondents who were also asking about what is the bigger picture here of PIDs within research, and some more technical or specific questions about interoperability or metadata. But again, a lot of this is very general, big topic stuff. So that was also reflected when we asked our next question of our audience. Sorry, next slide, please. Which was basically just an open questions they had about PIDs, things that were still confusing them. And we got a whole range of answers that went from stuff that I think most people who work in the space would think are fairly well defined, let's say, or addressed, like where to obtain and create PIDs, or they just don't see that there is a necessary use case or usage of PIDs. They're not convinced that it's something they need to do. Or even what the EOS PID policy means practically. So yeah, I think, sorry, I just see half of a comment there from Nick, although I can't see the whole thing, but it seems like I agree, I think we do have actually quite a bit of a biased view. And I think that one of the very nice things that came out of this workshop and this specific part of the workshop is that we are actually, the rest, people outside of this little bubble are quite a few steps farther back than we are. But at the same time, there are also people involved who were asking very similar questions to what we've been asking, I think, like what guarantees long-term persistence? Who is the source of governance for PIDs and PID stacks? Questions about DOI, quite a few actually, about the difference of DOI and PIDs in general. Questions about interoperability, metadata requirements, as you can see, these I think are more topics that we ourselves are concerned about, but I think it's very important to remember that these aren't the only questions that still exist in the broader sphere. So next slide, please. Based on that too, we had a series of breakout sessions. And the idea with these breakout sessions is we first introduced this topic of research data workflows. So I'm going to go on a limb and say that most of the people who've been invited to this session are familiar with what a research workflow is, but we specified them around 3 different types of objects. So in this case, publications, software, and data sets. And we really wanted to take people through and have them think about what was working in regards to PIDs within those workflows and what wasn't, and generate some ideas for improvements while still taking the CAT and reflecting back from the policy that's already been developed and the policy that we are now trying to enforce, or at least guide people towards. So they had some really lively discussions. One section, as I said, was on publication. And basically the outcome from that was that this perspective of owners and selection of appropriate PID services is quite important, but wasn't really covered in the EOS PID policy. So again, finding these kind of gaps that, although the EOS PID policy does provide a lot of useful information, it's not a finalized, finished, end-all, be-all. They also reviewed considerations for owners to select an appropriate service, which I think is something that's important to keep in mind. You know, it's not always self-evident, and it's something that I think causes a lot of owners quite a bit of strife to have to decide how to make that decision. And also that this policy isn't necessarily a binary policy, that some refinement is needed, and especially for implementation in something like a compliance assessment toolkit. So I think those were great reflection points and great points. And then we also had a second session, if you could switch to the next slide, please. And that one was actually very well, sorry, I'm jumping ahead of time. The next one was the software one. This one, we kind of focused on the research workflow of SWITs. So that would be the software hash identifier, if I'm remembering the acronym correctly. Oh, sorry, yeah, that's just that one. And here we actually had some very interesting discussions too. I think software is a little more of an underserved object within the discussions of persistent identifiers. It's a little bit of a more emerging PID or newer one anyway. Thank you, Software Heritage. Thank you, Dimitri. And what I think was a really interesting discussion that came up in that session was this idea of intrinsic versus extrinsic PIDs, which aren't official terms, but are ones that we were defining within this breakout. And the idea there was that we have these PIDs that, you know, a person thinks consciously about and consciously mints and consciously curates some metadata for and maintains, but especially with something like software, you also have to create attached PIDs that are mostly entirely done by machines. So for example, if you want to cite a specific version of software that you have uploaded to a Forge or a specific couple lines of code, that's also a PID, but we considered that then more of an intrinsic PID that could be kind of generated by a machine only from implied information from a more higher up PID, let's say. So we had some interesting discussions about that, and that maybe there are different requirements for those two, and that it is maybe a useful distinction when talking about PIDs that's not necessarily always made. We also had some really interesting discussions about commitment, which is a reoccurring theme, I think, in this space, about you know, who's responsible for new acronyms. Fair enough. We do have too many acronyms. But yeah, so this idea of like who is responsible for updating the PID, who is allowed to mint a PID for an object, these sorts of things. And we thought specifically with software, you already have this idea of license information of who owns the software, who can fork the software, what can be done with the software, and that could maybe help inform also who can mint a PID for that software, who becomes responsible if they fork said software and need to assign a PID to that fork, that sort of thing. It was lively and not a solved discussion, to be honest. We also had an interesting discussion because we found out that at Software Heritage, they do quite a bit of human-based curation on PIDs, which is something that in my personal experience hasn't been talked about as much. So they actually have folks who do review the software that's submitted, who do review the metadata that's been submitted. They have a checklist that they go through. And so we also had a discussion there that, like, you know, human involvement can produce human error, and it's, you know, can you standardize that a little bit? Should we be tracking within the metadata for these PIDs exactly who curated this metadata and what lists they use to curate this metadata? Is that valuable tracking over time and with this kind of persistent thing? And then finally, we just came to the conclusion that, you know, as much as it would be great to let everyone do everything all the time, there are parts of these workflows and parts of these objects that simply require specialists, that require training, that require adaptation time and those sorts of things. And that's really important to remember, that although we want to make things open to everyone, we do need trained and experienced experts to handle certain parts of these processes, and we cannot get away from that. Then we had our final breakout session, thank you, which was on data sets. This was by far our most well-attended breakout, which was nice to see. So clearly there's quite a bit of interest in basically how you should incorporate PIDs in the research workflows for generating data sets. And I think they had quite a lot of lively debates on this idea of, you know, we can define policies, we can define best practices, we can share guidelines. PID providers can do every little thing to be in compliance with these policy best practices and guidelines and to enable their users to do those things. But at the end of the day, you can't guarantee, you cannot force your end users to do so. And you have to always be accounting for that fact. You cannot ever expect everyone to be following the rules. And we've had a lot of discussions about the importance of interoperability between PIDs and other tools, I think, such as like graphs or research management software or any sort of things like that. And that's really still a missing component that they felt could really be improved upon. And then the other one that they basically, I think, came down to is that this data workflows and PID maintenance within those workflows remains complex. That just simply the complexity of the object you're working with in the first place means that there's more complexity to maintaining PIDs around that, and that it's such a broad object as well that you really have to, at some point, I think, accept the fact that there's going to be custom solutions and custom and complex solutions. It's, again, you can't get, much like in software, you will not be able to get rid of experts. You will not be able to make everything easy, and you cannot force people to comply. And maybe it's a little bit the writing on the wall that we have to accept that none of this will ever be super duper easy. And basically, if we go to the next slide, those were the big outcomes of our 3 breakout sessions and our Mentimeters and our workshop in general. And you can also, if you were piqued interest or you want to hear more about the extended version of Wim's previous presentation, those are available and recorded up on our website. And we hope that some of these topics and stuff and possible solutions that were discussed in the breakouts will be submitted and enacted upon in the open calls that we'll be releasing in the new year. So thank you so much. Hopefully this sparked some ideas for you guys. Or maybe just made you really angry because you have a very strong opinion about something that was said. But which I think is great. I think open debate is the best way to solve some of these complex problems. And on that note, thank you, and I'll be happy to take any questions you guys have if we have time.
Yeah, thank you very much, Natasha, for providing this very interesting presentation on the findings of where the CAT was applied in practice as well. So now that you've heard both presentations, I saw a question at least in the chat, so let's start from there. So Ellie put into the chat a question for Wim. Is there any relation or preliminary thoughts between the assessment and the rules of participation plus the EOSC observatory, and how the assessment could possibly support them?
Yes, so yes and no. So the compliance assessment toolkit has been set up with the express intention of also using it for other kinds of assessments, such as evaluating, let's say, compliance with rules of participation. But we have no explicit task at the moment to integrate the two. So while it's possible to implement a version of the toolkit that looks at rules of participation, there's no current effort to do so. What could be useful, though, is to look at the rules of participation through the lens of expected capabilities of service providers, and to add that to the community's expectations of PID service providers. So that's something that is a useful addition, and thanks for that, because I think one can look at it from that perspective.
Thank you, Wim. René Belzer has raised his hand, so please go ahead.
Yeah, right. So you say that there are certain parts of the PID minting workflow that surely needs experts, but I just can't help thinking that that just doesn't cut it, because I mean, we have to go for machine automation. I mean, there has to be such that the PID minting is automated through computer processes, where I mean, so that you can have a let's say a data stream being submitted possibly before, possibly after some processing or scrubbing automatically submitted to repositories where the minting process is part of the automation. So it's a complete showstopper that you need to have experts involved, in my opinion. Could you comment on that? I mean, surely that must be an aim to get rid of the people.
Yeah, I'll go first. I'm just guessing Wim also wants to reply to this, and that's what his raised hand is about, but I'll go first. So I think the idea here is, of course, you want to get as much machine actionable as you can. And I think that's also why we had this long discussion within that breakout session of intrinsic versus extrinsic PIDs, where when we talk about the intrinsic ones, that those are the ones that are fully machine actionable, do not require any sort of expert or human intervention at all. But this idea that there is going to be a moment where someone who has an idea of what they're doing inputs that first kernel of data. I mean, maybe it's not going to be in the persistent identifier part of it. Maybe it's earlier on when you first generate the data set, but someone has to be at least aware of where that information will be going downstream, that it's going to be plugged into all these sorts of automated systems and how those automated systems are going to be using them in order to be able to input those first bits of metadata correctly. So I think it's nice. I think the goal of getting as much of it automated as possible is important. But I'm not sure, and at least, I mean, it's not entirely my opinion, obviously, like it was also the breakout session. No one in the breakout session seemed to be convinced that you'd ever be able to 100% ditch someone with prior knowledge and some sort of training about how to put this information in at some point along the entire process. Hopefully, again, it's only maybe one point. But yeah, hopefully that's kind of where the discussion went.
Yeah,
Okay,
I think sorry, yeah, just in addition to that, it depends very strongly on the use case. At the one end of the spectrum, you have persistent identifiers issued to peer-reviewed journal articles, and there, I think automation of the curation step, which is essentially the peer review, is not something that is going to happen soon, if ever. On the other end of the spectrum, you have the need for automated issuing of persistent identifiers at enormous scale, where there's almost no need for human intervention anyway, such as minting versions of vocabulary elements and so on. So it's dependent on the use case. In the data repository environment, the topic of automating some of the curation steps that are required, especially if you are a trustworthy repository, is an emerging topic. And there is work underway to automate as much of it as possible, because otherwise, you're right, it's not scalable. But as I say, it depends on the use case, and you need a variety of solutions depending on those use cases.
Thanks.
Thank you, Wim. I think there is do you want to, Renee?
No, I just think that kind of is a crucial target. I mean, it has to be that it is completely automated. I mean, we have instruments, sensors that constantly spew out huge amounts of quantities of data that needs to go into repositories for researchers to collaborate on, and that has to be automated. I mean, otherwise, it just I mean, the whole thing dies if it doesn't get automated. So it has to be a goal that is recognized, and that has to be an end goal to get rid of the people in the process. Maybe not setting it up. I mean, setting it up, preparing it, and making it ready to take the instrument data is fine, that there are people there, of course, data stewards, experts, and so on. But then once it's set up, that's it, no more people.
If I may ask, so you bring up this use case there where you have instruments that are doing constant monitoring, constantly spitting out information. Right. That's like one step in that data set's life cycle, right? So I agree that for that particular part, that should be all automated, or I've worked with big data, so I agree. I know the pain that you can have there if that's not all automated. But that's only the first part of that data's life cycle. It's going to be processed and transformed and visualized and all those things. And I believe, you know, there are parts along that way that it's equally important to keep persistent identifiers attached to that data set. And you can get into the idea of like, you know, when does it become a new persistent identifier? When does it need a new persistent identifier? All that stuff. But I think parts of it, again, can be all automated. Like that step certainly should be in order to make it a manageable and usable data set. But that's not the only incarnation of that data set will go through, and that maybe somewhere farther along the line, you will, again, when it gets to publication, will that be all? Can you really automate that part, all of it? But that's still part of that life cycle for that data set.
Yeah, so maybe I see there's some other questions, Josephine. So I think it's an important topic, and it will for some time require a mixture of automation and humans, depending on the use case. Having a goal of scaling it and automating it is good, but it's not going to happen overnight.
Yeah, so there is another question for you, actually, Wim, from Nick. You had on one slide a compliance authority, and he wonders whether that was directly from the policy.
Yes, so it's mentioned in the policy, so we've added it as an actor in the ecosystem. It doesn't exist yet, but presumably something like EOS PID policy compliance ultimately has to be governed and managed by some kind of authority.
And the next question is from Ari. Are there similar approaches towards PID compliance outside of Europe? Is the European PID policy and CAT unique IDs globally?
Yeah, so we've looked around quite a bit and we may have missed them, but we didn't. There are PID policies at national level in some cases that we've looked at and are adding, if needed, to the scope of what the policy should include. But something like the toolkit, I think not yet, no.
Okay, yet another question for you, Wim, from Maggie. What constitutes a PID provider? What about a community repository that accepts data DOs from providers and assigns PIDs to the objects on behalf of the uploaders, acting as a middleman? Should these repositories also check their compliance with the policy?
Yes, so those that upload or host data objects on behalf of the owners and interact with providers are called managers in the EOS PID policy, and there are some of the criteria that apply to managers. So in some cases, the roles are conflated. So for argument's sake, if you are using ARCs or handles directly, then not all of the actors are involved, or some of the actors have more than one role as defined in the policy. But I think these are by now well sorted out and reasonably well aligned still with what the policy has published.
Okay, so there is a last question in the chat from Bo. If there is a human involved in the process, there is obviously always a chance of a mistake. Will there be a need for somebody to handle that mistake?
Yes, that's true. The converse is also true. So one of the approaches, for instance, with automated curation, if you think about identifying sensitive data and checking whether the license is appropriate for the type of data, there you could potentially use AI or some kind of machine learning to classify deposits or objects in terms of their GDPR sensitivity. But you must err on the side of caution. So if you find instances where the machine cannot be sure, humans will have to verify it afterwards. So I think in both directions, maybe a combination of machine action and humans will give us the best quality at the end of the day.
Thank you, Wim. I think I don't see any other raised hands or questions in the chat for now. I think it is time for me to present the Fair Impact use case work, just really quickly, I think we should reserve some time towards the end to have an interesting discussion yet, so I will try to make it really brief. The next slide, please. So within Fair Impact, we have 4 tasks dedicated to working around PIDs, one of which I will briefly present to you. And this is a piece of work done together with 8 integrated use case partners representing different disciplines. Next slide. So the main task of this of the use cases are to document best practices on PIDs when managing different research workflows, different types of data sets and research objects. And the result will be shared across domains. And the goal is to try and, to the best of our ability, to translate the content in a way that is domain agnostic and is suitable for uptake by the broader research community. And one way of achieving this is to interact with different scientific communities through workshops. So we have already arranged a series of those, and some more are within the pipeline. Next slide, please. So the use case partners work to explore 3 different areas related to persistent identifiers. So we work on PIDs in data production workflows, PIDs in complex data citation, and lastly, PIDs and sensitive data. And in addition to these 3, the use cases also aim to explore relevant related topics such as reproducibility, research object type definitions, granularity, versioning, etc. So the next, please. Yeah, could you just bring all those bubbles front, please? Thank you. Yeah, I have this animation involved in these slides. And next one. Yes. So that was all I was going to say about the use cases. I think next I will be briefly presenting a report made by the collaborative network called Knowledge Exchange. So if you can go to that slide, please. Thank you. So I will present some recent findings from a published report from the Knowledge Exchange on PIDs and related risks and trust dimensions. And so here you can see some risks involved in this discussion. So I think it's really important to, in order to understand how to create trust, you also need to explore the risks involved. You can see the risk that came up in this study, which is based on a literature review and a round of interviews among various range of different PID experts from within Europe. And the risks are categorized into political, economical, social, and technological. First, the political risks. They can be, for example, related to discontinued services and commercial stakeholders. And if we go to the economic risks, next slide, please. We have, for example, these were found through that study. That can be, for example, a lack of funding, especially for somewhat smaller organizations, and contingency funds. And then over to the social risks involved, they mostly, as you can see, they relate to people infrastructure in different ways. And then lastly, the technological risks can be due to poor interoperability or services offering poor metadata description opportunities. And on this slide, you can see the identified trust indicators, which mostly involve around organizations, technology and services. And then on the next slide, there is yet another diagram showing also the trust enabling factors. So firstly, there needs to be trust between individuals in the form of trusting relationships. And next, there need to be, if you look at the top left side, trust in also the technology. And in the upper left side, here states that there needs to be trusts in the organizations, also managing PIDs, obviously. And lastly, on the upper right side, let's see. Yeah, you can see the perceived risks. And lastly, sort of a message saying that early and good experiences with a PID is important for establishing trust. So that was a main sort of summarizing finding coming out of this study. So that was my last slide, I believe. Can you try and see, Sarah? I think it was the last slide I had.
Yeah, it is.
Yes, that was, that was it. Yeah, thank you. So now we will move forward and hear some thoughts on this topic from our use case partners. As I said, we have 4 out of the 8 use case partners involved in this discussion today. And the first use case partner I will consult in this matter is Hervé Lehors from University of Essex and the UK Data Service. But in this context, more so in his expertise in the CESDA, Eric. So I hope Hervé is here and ready to give his thoughts on some of these topics. So I would like to ask you, Hervé, what are your thoughts around persistence in a PID system?
Hi there, are you hearing me okay?
Yes.
Okay, I've got an echo, bear with me a moment. So yeah, it's been a really interesting conversation and has kind of changed some of my perspectives on what I was going to say as well. Our use case is primarily about sensitive data. So we've got some very specific needs. We need to be looking at the difference between looking across the changes in digital objects that impact their sensitivity. We know that some of the underlying issues are around output checking, visibility, and the theme that keeps on coming up is responsibility. And we know that we don't yet have the machine actionable rights management to really hold that through. One of the questions that we've got is what ends up in a future PID kernel. I think rights are a fairly uncontentious thing in there, but they're certainly not machine actionable. And we are leaning towards maybe the need for a high-level statement in the PID kernel about where there is some sensitivity issue before we drill down into the more machine actionable side of things. Just so that we can really highlight across a graph or across an analysis where there is a sensitivity risk as a priority. But a lot of what I'm hearing today does reflect the fact that there are a lot of common issues, and a lot of our sensitive data issues are common across lots of other different use cases. Our PID minting scenario at UK Data Service is fundamentally automated through to DataSite. But there is a separation between a technical assumption that a digital object remains unchanged at the bit level versus the dynamism of research data objects over time. And I think that's where the human factors come in and where the different practices come in. I don't think we're ever going to come up with a perfect version change management system that can be adopted everywhere. But I think it's becoming clear that we need to be better at communicating those version and change management systems to each other to support future interoperability. And to support end users and understanding not only when a digital object will change, but why a new PID might be minted, or why some of the kind of version management change log functionality might be used within the PID system. So DataSite, for instance, will allow you to do that as well. So I think that I was really interested in the toolkit. But I think that those minting PIDs also need to define exactly where they're making human decisions about change. I think that's the baseline. Not a common approach to change in version management, but it may be a common way of describing change in version management. And that applies across all the use cases that we're seeing in fair impact, I think. And then for us, looking at the sensitive data use cases, I mean, this is still emerging at the moment, but we really are seeing the machine actionable rights around sensitive data as critical. Now, for us, that's about communicating the kind of sensitivity tiers that can change an entire workflow. You know, we might split a digital object between a highly sensitive version and prepare a version which has got a much lower level of sensitivity, with the intention of making it maybe less useful but more accessible, without having to go through multiple steps of approval and working in secure research environments, etc. And every one of these changes is a version change that changes sensitivity and has got PID and PID kernel implications that we need to be very careful about. But going all the way back to the beginning of the discussion is something that was mentioned earlier. I'm trying to work out a way to communicate sensitivity and its implications in a workflow. But I think we're still some way away from even being able to go to a digital object and say with any assurance how long it will even be available, how long it will be retained for. And I think that's a very practical step we can take to talk about the longevity of the digital objects. You know, most environments have got some kind of retention period. And then from there, we're looking at what curation is being offered, what preservation is being offered. And I think there are several layers of metadata that could really improve the assurances that end users receive about the digital objects that are being resolved to.
Thank you very much, Hervé. Any immediate reflections on what Hervé just said? Yeah, you said something in the chat from Maggie. Does this relate to this discussion?
Yeah, I was just trying to make the point that we already have, based in the FAIR principles and the recommendations there, suggested mechanisms for really adding much more sort of graph connections between different versions of the same thing, or different formats, or different stages in the sort of a natural progression of a digital object throughout its life cycle that one of the previous speakers was alluding to. So I think mechanisms are there, but there need to be good best practices for exactly which framework to use and how to apply this, which is then discipline specific and also specific between different types of objects that we need to describe. But that's just my naive view. So maybe some semantics expert like Barbara or someone could comment on that later on.
Yeah,
and so just to briefly comment and to comment on, I think, see Richard's comment as well. Yeah, there are loads of different approaches, and I think that the buckets are there for us to put the metadata in. And I think that the mechanisms are there for us to manage access control. I mean, we do that through things like the 5 safes approach, and, you know, we're managing the interactions between researcher training and evaluations that projects for sensitive data are for the public goods, and evaluations that environments remain protected. In terms of access control, in terms of relationships between objects, yeah, we do have, you know, predecessor and successor objects and everything else. But I think you're right, Maggie. I think this basically comes down to clearly communicating how what our local approaches are. There will inevitably be local approaches. Can we get better at communicating those in a standardized way, maybe?
Yeah, Maggie, do you care to repeat your question so that Barbara can take a stand on it?
Oh, I think that just taking up a lot of time. I was just saying that there are these possibilities to add qualified references to other entities within the metadata of a FAIR object. And so depending on which semantic standard and which semantic tool set, so to speak, that you use, I guess you will be able to find all these things like is a parent of and is a child of and all of those different things you can add. But my question there is really sort of, should it be already at the kernel level? Is that necessary so that you can speed up maybe the machine actionable process of finding data and evaluating if a digital object can or should be used for a given purpose? Or is it okay just to have that kind of metadata in a more broad catalog level? Those are details which maybe we don't need to talk about today, but which also needs to be sort of put into the best practices schema of things.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Maggie, for reiterating the question. So yeah, please go ahead, Barbara.
I think it's really hard to answer this right away, and I think it needs more attention, what exactly should be in and not. But as I understand, the FAIR digital object architecture has this core metadata and then additional metadata. So you need both levels. And I think this is possible, but where exactly this should be defined. So what should be included and not is a very difficult or needs more attention. Should be a workshop on that. And I think people are already thinking about this. So I'm not the one who can really answer this right away. But and I could not follow everything, unfortunately. So I have an issue there with the semantic artifacts. They don't use completely good, so they lack of, I call this Kubernetes bits, whatever, yeah, because, well, the identifiers are not totally, probably not persistent, not really complying with all the requirements we have mentioned today. But this is what linked data is. We have different approaches, and we are not going to force all the semantic people to change the identifier system. But yeah, we need to have some persistence, and this I'm sure that the semantic experts are aware of, but they are not following everything what is here discussed here. So it might be a challenge further up.
Thank you, Barbara. I think we will move to the next use case partner and hear their thoughts related to this topic. So next we have Renato Iuacabaneto, who comes from the EBI, so the European Bioinformatics Institute. So you are offering and maintaining a PID system called Identifiers.org. So I would like to hear your thoughts on trust and sustainability in PID systems, if you may.
So what I can say about that, sustainability has been something that we have been worried since the beginning of Identifiers.org. I guess Nick can probably talk more about the beginning of Identifiers because he's been there managing it at the time, I think. But the sustainability has been an issue, and we tried to solve it. We tried to address it by first making the source code of the service, the whole service, being open source, and trying to federate it as much as possible. So the idea is that Identifiers.org is a very lightweight open source middleman for resolving data. And the actual management of the data, of the metadata of the actual object is done by the data provider itself. So the data, we assume that the data provider has the ID, and we create namespaces separated by prefixes that they can, that is going to resolve to the actual provider ID. So by having this very lightweight service that is federated by having the providers managing it, and since it's open source, people can, if it goes down for some reason, people can just take up the responsibility and have it up again by another institution, for example. We try to address this kind of problem with sustainability. And the part of trust is something that we haven't addressed much, but we are happy to work on. We try to provide the service that is always there, so it's trusted in terms of being stable, and it's scalable, and it's curated by humans, so you can trust that the data there is actually valid. I hope that helps answering the question. Or at least...
Thank you very much. That was a really good answer to my question. And Nick put into the chat as well, sustainability is crucial for core services.
Yeah, I mean, like Renato said, I was there at Identifiers.org at the start. It started in the EOSC feasibility study, so a long time ago. It's like 2008. And we built it up to be kind of a core service. It's used to provide canonical URIs for records and to link those to alternative resolving locations and provide a standard URI that can be used in kind of knowledge graphs and you know, a canonical form that you can harmonize across sources with. And the problem always has been to try and get funding for that. So you're always looking for how you're going to get support for that going forward. And there's that human curation aspect as well. So you need to, you know, that's not automatable, but we did, when I was there, come up with systems to try and collaborate with other people and feed into the same meta resolver. We called it a meta resolver because it takes, you know, these namespaces that you assign, and those namespaces are shared across meta resolvers. So it was quite an overarching effort, but funding is always challenging for services like that, especially where it's kind of maintenance and small updates, you know, to improvements. Finding ways to fund that is difficult. But you know, one thing that we did was we had a sunsetting policy, like Renato said, to make everything, all the information and the code available if it ever disappeared. So sunsetting policy and sustainability and funding is important for these for PID systems.
Okay, thank you, Nick. So there is a question in the chat from Richard. Can you use encryption? I think
I'm assuming that's for the previous survey, right?
Oh.
Is it?
I'm not sure.
So Richard, do you want to specify to whom this question was directed?
Yeah, well, I can briefly answer anyway. Yeah, Richard raises 2 points, both of which are highly relevant to managing secure research environments. One was layered access control, and the other one is encryption, both of which are essential parts of running these underlying systems in a secure way.
Yeah, thank you. So we still have 2 more use case partners that will present some of their reflections around this discussion point. So next up we have Parham Ramazani, who comes from the LifeWatch ERIC. And so Parham, I would like to ask you, what are the features and functionalities you find valuable in a PID system?
So could you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
So basically, identifying resources is the key element in our data management systems. So we usually we are for distributed infrastructure with a lot of researchers designing, creating, generating different digital objects like dataset and services. So there is a demand for strategies to trace our research activities. So with that said, streamlining the creation and assigning of PIDs to our research entities is the fundamental expectation that we have from the PIDs provider. So, however, I think they're doing very well. I think they're creating these rich metadata schemas that increase interoperability and also explicitly define the relationship between different digital objects and other entities like organization and individuals. It's really important for us because it facilitates semantic discovery over our assets. Another key point for us is reusability, which also realized through the citation information that provided by DOIS in particular case.
I was muted. Thank you, Parham. If I can take just another question from you. So what factors contribute to building trust in a PID system according to you?
Well, we usually rely on the transparency that this provider have there in future strategic plans and their decision makings. Also, we can trust them if they have a good credibility in the scientific area. But for a specific our use case, we're not really worried about this part of aspect because this should be care of from the provider side. We usually try to streamlining the process. For example, we have these functionalities in our platforms that user can log in with ORCID ID. So if this user intend to do something in our system, for example, publish a digital object like semantic artifact in our repository, first he can request for the DOIS and it will be created and assigned automatically through a dataset services, and the information related to user will be considered as a metadata to this new uploaded semantic artifact in our repository. So it's really speed up the submission of different digital objects in our communities.
Thank you, Parham. Do we have any reflections or questions for Parham? If there aren't any, I think we could hear from our last use case partner, which is Nick Judy, coming from the University of Manchester. So what are the challenges that PID systems need to address to meet researchers' needs?
Hi, I guess I better keep it short, otherwise we have like 2 minutes. So I think the way people work nowadays is different. Before we might be more interested in identifying single data sets or things like that. But now researchers typically will work with multiple inputs, execute various services, methods, algorithms, software on those, and end up with multiple objects, research objects, digital objects as part of their work. So what you end up with is kind of multiple objects, multiple outputs from one piece of work, which I think the challenge is to interrelate those, and there might be different formats, they're held in different places, different relationships that need to be expressed between them, and to capture that together in some way. And I think it's no surprise that our use case in Fair Impact has been centered around that. So it's working with Workflow Hub and RO-Crate, and what we wanted to do was to kind of push that information out there and encourage researchers to use our systems to kind of promote the findability and usability of workflows and how they typically work. So to do that, to try and push that information out, we had a support offer in the open call recently around RO-Crate and signposting, and we've been kind of advertising. We had a Workflow Hub Ask Me Anything session, and in hot news off the presses, we're going to have another Workflow Hub centric workshop on the 9th of February. So I'll put the information out there soon.
Thank you very much, Nick. Do we have any questions? If not, I would like to maybe reflect a little bit on the questions that we asked ahead of this workshop. So especially I see that we have somewhat, I think 9 entries or something currently in the spreadsheet. So please, just a reminder for you to go and populate that one. That is really valuable information for us. I would like to have just briefly towards the end, I think we have just a few minutes more time, a discussion around what are the guiding principles for you when you are choosing a PID system or a service. That would be really interesting to hear from you in the form of a discussion here as well. Any thoughts on that? I see the word sustainability mentioned a few times here. So probably something around well-established sustainable PID systems, but anything other in particular that you would like to bring from to this discussion? Maggie, please.
Yeah, so I think for ICOS that I'm representing in this context, that the governance is open and not potentially hijackable by some political entry or some specific nation from when political things change. I think that's a very important thing, and that the governance and also the overall willingness to share documentation about how the system works and who can be an agent of the system, who can be hosting a satellite copy or replicate of information, etc. That is very important, apart from the actual fact that it should be around a couple of years.
Yeah, good points. So I guess also that the funding structure would play a huge role there also in terms of sustainability. Yeah, so you brought up the roles being defined and clear. So that is, of course, also something that is really important, and that also the IASC PID policy lifts front, so that it is very clear which are the roles involved and who is responsible for which part of the maintenance, for example. And yeah, Javier, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, thank you. I think that there are some lessons to be learned because when we're speaking about persistent identifiers, we're speaking about the ones that are related to EOSC, but we should know also that, for example, we have the ECLI, which is the ones that are for the rulings in the which is coordinated around European Union. So every ruling from the European Court of Justice or from the national courts, now they do have it's a PID, but for legal rulings. And I think that sustainability there is guaranteed by the national members, by the members of the European Union. And I think that we perhaps could research a little bit around that, because that we could learn some lessons on how they are doing that.
Very good point, Javier. Thank you for that. And Marianne has her hand raised as well.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for all the discussion so far. I was triggered by the word sustainability and the roles. because I think most of you know that last year we had a similar series of workshops, which also included a session on PIDs. And 2 of the 3 recommendations we extracted from that session already addressed the topic of sustainability and how important it is, and that we will need more clarity on the roles in the PID landscape. So to sound positive and hope maybe it inspires you, if you have not worked on a spreadsheet, do you notice any differences for the better, I hope, compared to, let's say, last year? Because that is one of the things we try to do in the Synchronization Force workshop, make these snapshots from time to time. Where are we? Where do we want to go? And ideally, we do see that we have, as a community, made some progress. So with the background of the spreadsheet, please flag it up when you know things that have changed for the better or become more specific or things like that.
Oh, that's interesting, Marianne. Thank you for raising these observations of yours. That's really interesting. Yeah, indeed. If you have any thoughts on that compared to last year, if you were part of the PID session then as well, so just let us know. There is a question in the chat from Wim to Javier. Do you have a link to the PIDs for EU rulings that you mentioned?
Yes, I am copying and pasting in just this moment.
Yes, please go ahead.
There it goes.
No hurry there. Do we have any other comments or questions? Any reflections, for example, on the trust? But I think we have touched upon it already on a few occasions. But if there is something you would like to add to the trust discussion, that would be really interesting to hear as well. Yeah, so Stian inserted some interesting examples. For example, what would constitute trust where a service is mature, for instance, not have self-signed SSL certificates, as happened with the B2 handle.
Yes, so I'm just typing it in as you were talking. So yeah. This is to make the startup ramp not so steep, right? So I thought I knew a lot about PIDs, so yet I found it a bit hard just to get started as a regular user, when you should be given easy access, right? There should be an easy web form or something like that. Like for data side, it's very easy to get started, right? But you have to pay. Why can't EOS provide something similar where you can just get started very quickly? You're not faced with test services with outdated certificates as I was faced. You shouldn't have a 3 weeks lead time before you get an identifier, right? I mean, it's persistent identifier, not resistant identifier. So I think we need to make it much, much easier to get started.
Yeah, very good point, Stian. Any last reflections before we need to conclude this workshop for today? If not, I think we can end it here. Thank you very much for your attendance and for your comments and good discussions. It was a really interesting workshop. And please, do remember to populate the spreadsheet and also the note-taking document, at least for your own discussions that you've raised, so that they are correctly translated also in text format. So thank you very much, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Have a nice weekend.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Cheers.
Thank you.